Hey everyone, Wayne Fox here with a video in color management again. We're going to talk today about how to use an i1DisplayPro and i1 Profiler software to profile and then characterize your non-color managed display. So instead of a BenQ or an NEC, which has its own proprietary software, it's just a good old display, whether it be a Dell, an Apple Thunderbolt display, something a little older, something that the color management system of the computer will take control of, and actually still works great. I bought my higher-end displays. I didn't go back to all my old files and suddenly discovered that I could make a lot better prints. To be honest, there really visually isn't much difference at all, and you have to look really hard. So there's nothing wrong with this. It'll work great for you, no problem, as long as you profile it and then calibrate it to your viewing area, and that's really the key step, is that calibration process. So let's talk a little bit about Xrite first. The license for what it allows you to do is contained within the device. So the device acts like a dongle. And the i1DisplayPro will authorize certain parts of i1 Profiler software, which is like a generic package which covers most of their devices, including devices to make printer profiles, etc. It'll authorize the ability to profile a monitor or a display. Now, they have another device that's a little more affordable called an i1Display Studio, and I just want to mention it briefly because it looks like it's a great device. It's identical. The hardware inside is probably a little different, but the problem is it won't license anything inside of i1 Profiler, so you can only use i1Display Studio software, which is a stripped down version of i1 Profiler. And it has some limitations, and we'll talk about that a little bit, but mainly the next video I'm actually going to go through using this device and point out its limitations. It'll be a really short video. The other problem with this, if you're using something like a BenQ, which requires you to own a device like this, Xrite will not authorize third parties to access this device. So BenQ and NEC and ISO can't use an i1Display Studio with their software to make the measurements and do the calibration and make the profile. And so you really have, in that case, you have to buy an i1DisplayPro. Personally, I'm not sure I understand that. Anyway, that being said, let's talk about what our goal is and kind of review that real quickly, and then we'll get into making our profile. So let me start off first by mentioning you might want to have at least watched videos 5, 6, and 7 of my series. They're in a playlist because that's where we talk about the process of establishing a good color managed workflow, including evaluation area, printing test prints to evaluate and to make a display. Now let's understand there's only one way that this actually works, and that's if you calibrate your display to match your evaluation area. And so the evaluation area is much more critical than you think. If you really want your display to be a good predictor of printed output, then you have to have a good way to evaluate that output, and then you have to calibrate your display to that. And that means we're going to adjust the white point, and we're going to adjust the luminance of the display until what we see on our screen matches some test print that we've made. That's the only way to do it. You can't just dial in the white balance of your viewing area. For example, my viewing area has 3000K Sora bulbs, which are about 3500 to 3800K compared to other types of bulbs. And I can't just dial that number in and make a 3000K display. To be honest, I'm at 5800 most of the time, 5700 on my NEC. And that gives me a visual match. And that's the only way to do this, to calibrate it, is to visually look at the display, look at the corresponding print in the viewing area, and then remake the profile, changing the white point and the luminance until the point in time that we feel that this is a close enough representation of what our print looks like. When I work on the next file, now that's the information my brain's seeing. And because of that, there's a very high likelihood that when I make a print from that file, it will match my viewing condition as well. Normally, once you do that, those files look fine anywhere. Put them on the web. If you want to go to my site at waynefox.com and see some of my work, I think you'll find those files look just fine, even though they've been designed for printing. I don't make a different file for the web. I maybe should, because usually people on the web have a wider white point, but I don't. So that's the process we're going to do. We're going to establish a profile which characterizes the full capability of our display. We're going to use the native gamut no matter what software we use, no matter what display we have. There's no reason to put an artificial limit like making it fit into Adobe RGB. Think about it. If your monitor's Adobe RGB, the only way the manufacturer can do that is to make sure it exceeds Adobe RGB a little bit and then clip and force them when it makes the display. Well, why don't we go ahead and use those colors beyond it? We might as well. Our printer can print some of them. And certainly our file has some of them. So native gamut is what we want to use. And once we characterize the device and its capabilities, we also want to calibrate the white point and the luminance to match what we see. And so that's the process. It's trial and error. Usually you'll start at one point, you look, decide if it matches, and I'll talk about where in video 7, as we get into this, I'll have a timestamp to the video where I talk about how you can do that evaluation. So let's go ahead and jump into i1 Profiler and grab this i1DisplayPro and get this profiled and ready to go. Okay, so what I'm doing, I'm going to control my Thunderbolt display by mirroring it here. You'll notice that I've tipped it back. So that when we get ready to put it on, it's ready to go. I'll talk about that. Anyway, let's get started here. Let's start up i1 Profiler. And as it starts up, you'll notice that it's in what's called demo mode. And nothing is authorized. And if we want to use anything, we've got to license it. And of course, that's done by plugging in the device, which acts like a dongle. You should see the little light flash after a second or two. And once it does, the software should pick it up. And there we go. So now we're licensed to do basically 3 functions: to profile a display, to validate a profile, and to profile a projector. Let's go ahead and talk about the difference between basic and advanced mode as we go. I'll kind of go through the process and then I'll go back and forth so you understand the real differences. Obviously, we're going to do display profiling. And in this first screen, we want to make sure that the display that we have is the one selected and that the backlight source is the correct backlight source. And we're not going to use D65. We've already talked about why that's a problem. And so instead, we're going to go to daylight temperature. I think we're going to use 6,000. That's a good starting point, is 6,000. Again, luminance, we're going to leave it at 120. That's a good starting point. And then as we finish, we'll evaluate whether we need to make adjustments to those 2 numbers. And if so, we will and remake the profile. We're going to leave the response curve the same. The default is good. We don't care about sRGB or custom. Basically, this is the same as full gamut. We're going to leave the gamma the same. 2.2 is the standard. I do not like using any of the ambient color controls. You should be in an environment where the ambient light is dim enough that the light coming from the display is all that really won't affect your vision of the color. I've seen people try it and it can really mess them up, so I leave that off. Now, in this case, the next step, all we can do is go to measurement. And in the measurement mode, all we can do is measure this patch set. And so what we're going to do is go back to the beginning here, except we're going to go to advanced mode and talk about why it's preferred. Again, we're going to go to profiling. You'll notice that this is all the same other than we now have a contrast ratio. And I've never messed with this. I think that for what we're going to do for profile, native is what we want. And we have a new thing called flare correct. And I also, you should be keeping the flare off of your display. So I never use either of these 2 settings, okay? But we're going to, again, go to daylight temperature, 6,000, with 120 as our brightness level. Now we have another step that we didn't have in the basic mode. And here the defaults, which is what the basic mode uses, are a version 4 profile, which is okay for a non-printer profile, but it uses a matrix-based profile. And this basically uses 3 points to create a matrix, and it triangulates the colors based off those 3 points. We want to use a table base, so now we're going to use a lookup table, which is a better way to get a tight control of the color variations on your display. I've always felt it's better, most agree with me, and so we want to use a table-based display profile if we can. So that's one difference between this and the basic mode. Next difference is in this screen here, you'll notice that now we have the option of using a large patch set instead of a small one. And I've always felt the more colors you can sample, the better you can get a profile. And you'll notice we have a lot of variations in saturations and colors. And I think that the large patch set gives us a better result. Now, we're not going to use it today just because it takes so long. So we'll go ahead and use this small one. But that's typically why I like to use the advanced mode. We're ready to go to the next step. You can click the next step down below, or you can click the next button over here. Here we can see that it's got our device and it says it's ready. If our computer can control the brightness and all the other settings, which theoretically, for example, Thunderbolt display it can, and yet this doesn't work with Xrite. You still have to control it manually. So we're going to have this on. And before we click Start Measurement, if you're on a Mac and maybe on a Windows computer, we're going to open up our display preference pane to see if we can control our display brightness through that preference pane. And you'll notice here I have the BenQ and I also have the Thunderbolt, and you'll notice here I can control my brightness of this display. You can see it in the background with this slider. And this gives me a really good way to calibrate it. In case you have something like automatically adjust brightness, you want to turn that off. You don't want the display getting brighter and dimmer because suddenly the room's brighter. You need to control the room instead. So once we've done that, we can go back here and hit Start Measurement. If your display doesn't have a slider, if you can't control it with that, then you're going to have to use the buttons on your display or on your keyboard, however that works, to make those adjustments. So it tells us to open up the device. And once it does, it detects that. Now it tells us to hang it on the display. This weight slides along the wire so you can adjust it. And what I always do is I always tip the display back as steep as it'll go to make sure that gravity is holding that pretty tight. You're going to put it right there in the middle of the display like that and hit OK. And then you're going to hit Next. At this point, it's going to go through several colors and make sure your mouse cursor isn't under it. And what it's going to do now is allow us to adjust the brightness. Now we can either do it with keystrokes if we want. For example, on a Mac, you can make it go brighter or dimmer with keystrokes. The problem is that's not real finely controlled. There are a few keystrokes to make it more controlled, but what you can do instead, which is easier, is on a Mac hit Command Tab. On a PC, it would be Control Tab. Make sure that we don't have anything under our window. The BenQ is showing because I'm mirroring the two, so it shows me both. And now what we can do is use this slider, and we can control the brightness with the slider. Notice I can go to all the way to 25. At full brightness, it's all the way up to 328. And if you were using this 328 as your display brightness, you're going to make your prints, you have to darken your files down so much to make them look good that they're always going to print really dark if you print them. So what we're going to do is just move this slider until the number matches. And we're just going to move it, it'll settle, and then, tweak it. And you've got to get it within about 1. So right here, you notice I nailed it, 120. The green check mark comes on, and we're ready to go. So once you do that, click back over into this window to move those to the background, and then hit the next button. Now I'm going to go ahead and speed this up because this will take 3 or 4 minutes, and we'll speed it up so that it doesn't take that long, and you'll see it flash all these colors, and I'll be back as soon as we get to the next step. So it's done measuring all the colors, and you'll notice now it's verifying the profile. And this is a step that's automatic with i1Profiler. If you saw the last video where the BenQ software, it's a separate step that you have to perform. And I think it's nice that it does it. Basically, it's going to send a bunch of values to the display, measure the response, and make sure that the response it gets is what it expects. So it'll take another minute or so, about 30 seconds or so to verify the process here. Does this mostly with just gray tones, and then I think it sends a few of the just primaries when it's done, red, green, blue, and there we go. Now it tells us to take the device off, and to close it. This little thing protects the device and also is a diffuser for if you're doing a projector. Then we hit Next. And it says it's measured was successfully. You have to save it if you want to save that measurement data, which you really don't need to do. Now notice here something that's kind of interesting is that our measurement data, you'll see that the top left corner of each of these triangles was the color that was basically being measured, and the bottom corner is the result that was obtained. So you notice a lot of them are substantially different, and I've always felt what this profile has to do is it's got to map this color to this color because it's not getting an expected response. And you'll see that in this older display, it's there's some pretty interesting color differences in these blues, etc., that are just not what you would expect. Anyway, no big deal because that's what it's designed to do, is correct that. So we're ready to go to the next step. This is to make our profile. In this case, I'm going to rename this to TB. I don't need that big a name. We want to make sure we identify the monitor, the display that we're for really well. We also want to put in at the white point. We might, most of the time, you'll end up with 2 or 3 white points, and you can switch between them just by changing the profile. I'll just show that in a second. As far as the user level, for some reason, they don't go to the trouble of getting a administrator password so they can save this profile in the system level. I don't know about Windows, maybe it does. Here on a Mac, if this is a computer used by multiple people, then you need to go into the library, the user library, and move that from the ColorSync folder into the ColorSync folder of the system library. Most computers aren't used by multiple people, so it's not a problem. I don't usually enable the profile reminder with a more modern display. I don't think it's going to vary in 4 weeks. White LEDs are just much more stable than that. If it's an older display, CCFL backlit, you probably should do it, and you might want to turn that on. I wish they would give you a few other options, because probably every 2 or 3 months, if you have a white LED display, would probably be better. We're going to make sure ambient light monitoring mode is not on. And now we're just going to hit Save Profile. Was saved successfully. Now you'll notice here we have an option to compare profile. And I don't actually do this. What this allows you to do is bring up another profile, and it will show you the differences between the two. I would prefer that to just do that myself. Let's hit Cancel. Okay, so now I've got the profile loaded up. As you can see on my Thunderbolt display, we're showing the 3 target prints that we talked about in the 6th part of my video series. These are very good to help you understand how good your display is, as well as to evaluate how they look on your screen or your monitor versus how they look in your viewing area. And there we are going to look specifically at a couple of areas. We'll talk about that in just a second. What I'm going to do, I've got a camera set up behind me that's videoing this screen, and I'm going to put that camera in the corner over here. And as I change the settings, you should be able to see that reflected not only on the screen in the background behind me, but on the inset of the screen. Changing the profile doesn't actually change the color of screen recording, because somehow that's not being applied. And I guess it's because it's not actually recording the monitor, it's just recording the data. So anyway, let's open up the system panel, and we're going to go to Displays. And this shows both my BenQ and Thunderbolt display because it's being mirrored. If we go to Color, and currently what you see is the profile that we just made right here. And what I'm going to do now is switch to the default, which is the Thunderbolt display. And as I do that, you should see the color change. I don't know why it jumps like that. Let me go back and forth a couple times. And you see it gets slightly warmer. Here's a profile that I made earlier, and in this profile I went to a slightly warmer white point. I think normally in my case around 5800 gives me a match. So just as an example, we're going to go here and then here, and now compare it to the default. So we'll go here and now here. And the one thing I'll comment, if you change your white point, you do need to allow your eyes and brain to get a little accustomed to it. If you have it set to this color balance or this white point, and you go to one that's quite a bit warmer, visually that's a pretty stark difference, and your brain picks up on it right away. But as I've mentioned, we use adaptive vision, and what'll happen if you use the warmer profile for a while, just the opposite phenomenon occurs when you go back to the blue, and suddenly it looks really, really blue. And so that's why both in the luminance and the white point setting, you need to adapt it to a little bit. The real key is, as I look at my print here, and I look at my print in my viewing area, do the white points match, or does one look cooler or warmer than the other? Now, the key to that, and if you go back to video 7, and I'll put a timestamp on that actual part of video 7 in my series on how I talk about that. But what we're going to do is evaluate the white point, focus mainly on the gray value here, either this strip in the smaller target or this large area in the large target. And when it comes to luminance, we're going to mainly focus on, this is a target by Jack Fletcher. If we have the screen too bright or too dim, we're going to have a hard time seeing either the dark or the light squares. And I talk about that in that video too. So we won't go into that in more detail. Check that out, because that's really what we're trying to do. We're trying to look at this on our screen and say, okay, if I go here and I look at it, that looks a little warm compared to my print. If I go here, that's definitely cooler than my print. And you're just going to make profiles until you get to one that you feel really represents on the screen a very close proximity to what the print looks like. Once we've dialed that in, then all we need to do is use that setting, and as we adjust other files, our eyes are going to use that information. And what you'll find is when you make a print, it's also going to match, because we've calibrated the display to our viewing area and our condition that we're evaluating the prints in, the step that a lot of people don't talk about in color management. Well, that does it for this video today. Hopefully you found it helpful. Please feel free to ask me questions below. As I mentioned, I'll have a video on the i1 Studio hopefully in another 3 or 4 days. It does have some drawbacks. I actually don't recommend it. It's better than nothing. I also have another video, which I'm planning next week or two, on if you don't have a device like this and you happen to be on a Mac, with some displays, you can actually at least calibrate the white point and the luminosity so that you get at least a decent visual match. Usually the darkness and lightness of the screen and the white point is what really messes us up the most. So even without making a profile, I can tweak it and get a better match, and I'll have that video soon. Also, I'm headed up to Idaho in a few days, I think first of next week, visit with my buddy Randy Collier, and we're going to do a video about camera profiles, why we need them, when we should make them, when we should use them. He's pretty good at that kind of stuff, and I actually have never really bothered doing it because I basically just shoot outdoor daylight all the time. So that'll be an interesting video to watch for. Make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so when we get those videos out, you'll be able to watch them. Hey, thanks for watching today. See ya.